everybody, I'm Becky Glasby, the Director of Education here at the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky, and I'm the September 2018 Block of the Month designer for our Block of the Month Club. I'm really excited to kind of demonstrate a little bit about how to put this block together and share this block with you. It uses the technique of foundation paper piecing, so you can see we've got all these different quadrants and pieces together, and they're still stitched to the paper. So foundation paper piecing allows you to get these really sharp angles and more precise points than regular piecing can allow. It also helps with making really intricate designs or to get a little more accuracy in designs that are very complicated. So it's a great technique, and once you learn and we go through the demo, you'll be able to paper piece anything that you want to moving forward from the demo. I'm going to walk you through a little bit just on one quadrant of the piece and kind of take those small steps to bring it together and get everybody started on their road to maybe their first time foundation paper piecing, or for those who haven't done it in a while. Even those of you who've done it before, maybe you'll pick up a few tips or tricks or just new ideas as you go through for the block. Before I get started with stitching, I'd also like to point out some of the tools that I have in addition to our normal rotary cutter, cutting mats, and a regular quilting ruler, and some pins, of course. I've got sticky notes labeling all of my pieces so that I know which numbers and which pieces go in which section and which order to follow for foundation paper piecing. And then I've also got my template quadrant cut out, and you can see it's got all these numbers and solid lines together. And that's really one of the great things I love about foundation paper piecing is you just have to follow the numbers in order and you're stitching exactly on that solid line. So it really kind of takes some of that guesswork about where to stitch it together and which piece goes next. Everything is just printed right here on the template for you. And one of the other tools that's really excellent is the add a quarter ruler. And what this is, it's just kind of a regular ruler plastic template, but it's got a little edge on one side that's your 1/4 inch. And so as we go through into our folding and our trimming of our process, that little edge for that 1/4 inch really helps us trim our seam allowance accurately as we move through the piecing and without kind of the struggle of lining up a regular quilting ruler. So you can use the add a quarter if you have it. If you don't, you can also use a regular quilting ruler and still achieve the same results with our foundation paper piecing. The block is inspired by our educational programs here at the museum. As the education director, I run a lot of youth programs, tours, hands-on activities. We go off-site, we have youth camps and quilting classes, but we also do a lot with educating just our general public who comes through the museum, learning about quilts, learning about the different techniques and styles of quilt making and kind of the great creativity that you get with our exhibits, but then also providing workshops with master quilters throughout the year and kind of spreading that love and that excitement about quilting to anybody who comes through the doors of the museum, but also with those who are interacting through our programs and especially through the Block of the Month Club. So once you've prepared all of your pieces by cutting out around the outside of the dashed line on all of your 4 quadrants, because you need 4 of them to make a whole block. You want to cut those out. You also want to cut your fabrics. I've got mine labeled with sticky notes so that I can keep the numbers straight and know which pieces go where. You'll also want to lower the stitch length on your machine. So depending on what type of machine and how those numbers go, you want it in the range somewhere in that 1.5 to about 1.8 for the length of your stitch. And shortening the stitch really helps once you're stitching through both the paper and the fabric together, so that once we're finished with the entire block, we're going to be ripping that paper away. So the short stitch really helps hold the fabric seams together, but it also perforates the paper and makes it easier to remove those papers in our final step for the block. So you definitely want to lower that stitch length, again somewhere in that 1.5 to 1.8 range. And then once you've got all of your pieces prepped and cut and ready to go, we'll get started. So we're going to start with section number 1 and fabric piece number 1. And the side of the paper that has the lines and the numbers on it is considered the right side of the paper. So the wrong side of the paper is the blank side, and we're going to put our first fabric piece wrong sides together with our paper. and you want to hold it up. I tend to maybe hold it to a light or to a window just to make sure that when I've set it here that my fabric is going to cover all of the solid lines of section 1 and even spilling over to that dash line. This really helps make sure we have enough fabric to not only cover the section but also allow for that 1/4 inch seam allowance that we will be trimming into our blocks as we go through our steps. So once you know that it's lined up, it's kind of covering all the pieces that you need it to, you can put a pin in there. I really like the flathead pins because they allow you to use your rulers a little bit easier with the paper. And you see I'm pinning through the right side of the paper, right through the top there, through both sections to hold them together. So when that's pinned, you'll set that on your mat. And I've got a postcard here. You can use anything that's similar thickness to a postcard or a greeting card, cardstock, just something a little bit stiffer than normal paper. And we're gonna line that edge along the line between sections 1 and 2. And then I'm gonna fold just the paper over that card and crease it down. So if you have the add a 1/4 ruler, that little ledge of our 1/4 inch seam allowance, it just butts right up against our fabric there and allows us to trim off any excess fabric and leaving that seam allowance. If you don't have the add a 1/4, you can still use a regular quilting ruler and just take your 1/4 inch marks and carefully line those right along the folded edge of your pattern. Again, that will allow us to trim any excess fabric off while keeping that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to trim that extra out and just kind of set it to the side. Then you're going to unfold your paper, set the postcard to the side, and to set piece number 2, we're actually going to turn our whole piece over. So we see our fabric side again. And now with this nice trimmed edge, that gives me a guide of exactly where to set piece number 2 into the pattern. So I'm going to line those right sides together, our 2 fabrics, and then keep the edge of piece number 2 along our trimmed edge of the first piece of fabric. And then typically I hold these 2 pieces just kind of on those edges to bring them into the sewing machine, but if you want to put a pin in there, an extra pin to hold those 2 together, you're welcome to do that as well, whichever is comfortable for you to bring it in. So we're going to take those, set them right into the sewing machine, and like I mentioned, we've got these solid lines and numbers here on our pattern, so those lines are going to be our stitching guide. We're going to stitch right on that line. So an open toe foot where you can see those lines is going to be very handy for this type of stitching. I'm going to drop my needle kind of right before that line. And then like I said, just stitch right on the solid line itself. It's okay if your stitch runs a couple stitches just past the intersection of those solid lines. Because they're so close together, it won't really spill into all those details. So I've stitched right on this line between sections 1 and 2. I'm going to pull out my pin, and then when I turn it over to the fabric again, I'm going to open up fabric number 2 and then just give it a quick press on the iron to make sure it lays nice and flat and set the pieces together for our next step. So we've done a folding, and we've done trimming, and we've done stitching and pressing, all to join these 2 fabric pieces into our template. So we'll turn the whole quadrant over again so our numbers are facing up. And those 4 steps, the fold, trim, stitch, and press, are really what you want to remember for foundation paper piecing. So anytime you're going to do this technique, if you keep those 4 steps in order, that'll help you remember which piece to do next and kind of how to cycle through all of your sections in order to get your pieces together. So that being said, we're going to come back to our fold stage. I'm going to take the postcard again, and this time I'm lining it on that solid line that's between section number 3 and number 2. It's actually between sections 2 and 1 and 3. So kind of that really long line on our pattern. Line up my postcard. I'm going to fold just the paper over on our edge, and you can use the regular ruler or the add a 1/4 to keep our seam allowances together. And then we're going to trim off any extra fabric. So that's kind of step 2, that trimming of all those edges. And we'll unfold our paper We're gonna flip the quadrant over so we can add piece number 3. Again, we're going to line them right sides of our fabrics together so that they show up when we get them finally stitched on all those proper sides of our fabrics. And then also line the edge of piece number 3 right along that trimmed edge. Again, that helps us, gives us the guide of where it needs to go. I'm also going to hold this up just a little bit to make sure in the left to right here of my piece number 3 that I'm covering all of the edges from this side of the line all the way down. Since it's such a long line, I want to make sure that my piece is covering all of those ends of our line. So I'm going to hold it as I turn it and set it into the machine. Again, I'm going to set my needle down just right before that line between section 3 and 2. And I'm going to stitch right on this solid line to stitch this piece into the quadrant. When we pull that out, we've stitched on this line, and now I can unfold and open up piece number 3. I'm going to give that a press. So that's our steps 3 and 4 of our fold, trim, stitch, and press. Kind of becomes a mantra when you're doing foundation paper piecing to keep those together. And you'll notice that this piece covers a whole lot of my quadrant, and I even have fabrics that are hanging off the edge of my trimmed paper. That's fine. That should be how you want your piece to look, because we want to make sure we've covered all those edges as we go around and let those pieces hang out as they will until we get to those final steps to go together. So since we've pressed piece number 3, we've turned our quadrant back over so we can see our numbers, our right sides of the paper. We're going to move on to piece number 4 of our fabric. So again, we'll take our postcard, whatever piece of stiff paper that you're using, so that we can fold over our pattern. And then we'll take our add a quarter or the regular quilt ruler, line it up against the edge of that fold, and we're going to trim off any extra fabric. We'll set those over. We'll unfold our paper and turn it over, so now we have a nicely trimmed line to get our shape for section number 4. Again, our fabrics are going to go right sides together and lined up with that newly trimmed edge to bring it through. So we're going to bring it into stitch on the machine. Again, the ease of just stitching right on those lines takes any of that guesswork of how to keep our pieces and our angles together. That's what those lines are for. We'll open that back up. You can see we've got now this nice sharp point of our quadrant shape coming through as we add more pieces to our block. We'll give that seam a press and lay it nice and flat. Make sure that there's no kind of wrinkles coming together in there. And then we're going to go and add our final piece for this quadrant. So we're going to move on to piece number 5, which is between sections, or alongside sections 2 and 3. So that's where I'm going to put my postcard, that line between section 5 and section 2 and 3. I'm going to fold that paper over, and now I'm going to trim off any of that excess fabric that has been hanging over the edges. So now that we've trimmed, I can flip the quadrant one last time and take piece number 5 and lay it right sides together with our fabrics and along that newly trimmed edge so that I can stitch that final piece into place. Again, if your stitch goes just a little bit past those lines, that's perfectly fine to come through. So then I'm going to open up this last section, give that a final press. So now you can see our whole quadrant piece is put together, but it's got some of those kind of sloppy edges, those fabrics spilling over those edges of the paper, and we can even see a little bit of paper around our outer edge. Don't panic. What we're going to do is flip this back, and now we can trim our final 1/4 inch, kind of square up this quadrant, and that's what that dashed line represents, is our 1/4 inch seam allowance around the whole shape. So you can use that as your guide. I also like to kind of double check the stitching that I've done by putting my 1/4 inch line right on the solid line of the outside of the template. So then the edge of my ruler should be matching where that dashed line is printed on the page, and then I can trim both paper and any extra fabric that's all put together. I'm going to do all 4 sides that way. It cleans up all those edges, squares up your quadrants, and really just puts that final little touch to these little steps here as we've gone through them. So again, I'm lining up my 1/4 inch mark on the solid line and trimming off any extra fabric or paper. Get the last side. And then when we have now our nicely squared up little quadrant, when we turn it over, we have all of our pieces. We have no extra fabric hanging off the edges. And then you're just going to repeat all of those steps, that fold, trim, stitch, and press, until you finish each of the 3 remaining quadrants for the block. I've got 2 here. So you can see how they would go together. We'd have, 4 of our blocks coming all different designs into our block. So once you have all 4 quadrants done, you arrange them in your final layout, and then we're going to stitch those together. So this then becomes like any other 4-patch or traditionally pieced quilt block. So I'm going to flip these right sides together, line up, square up kind of those edges to make them nice and even. You can pin these together all the way through the layers. Sometimes it helps to keep them from shifting. If you have little clips, sometimes I find that really handy with paper piecing so that the pins don't have to go through all of those layers. And we're still going to use this solid line to help us stitch our design. So you can use the same stitch length, same foot, and just kind of line that up, and we'd stitch the whole way across our piece. Or, as you see, I'm going to switch to my 1/4 inch foot, and that'll help me keep it nice and straight all the way across the block to come together. So I've got my 1/4 inch foot that helps me guide my materials through. I still have my short stitch length for this step as well. And so when I stitch here, that 1/4 inch stitch will stitch right on the solid line that's printed on the pattern. Just kind of as a double check, or for your own comfort level, depending if you like that 1/4 inch foot versus the regular one for joining these pieces together. So once I have those 2, now I have those 2 halves, 1/2 of the block all put together. You would join your remaining 2 pieces and then bring all those together into the finished block so you have all 4 together. Of course, that means your block is done, but there's still one final step to come together, and that's taking the papers off of the back of the block, because nobody really wants a block that crinkles this way into their quilt. So we will turn it over, and then you'll want to carefully start pulling those papers away from our block until it's just the fabric that remains. Some of the bigger shapes are a little bit easier. They kind of pull off all in one strip. That came out really easily because of that shortened stitch length that we have with our machine. It perforates that paper, really brings it together. Sometimes you just have to go a little bit slower, a little bit carefully to bring those pieces out until you start tearing all of those designs of the paper out of our block, and then your block will be complete.